So how did LaRouche know the Mexican crisis and the derivatives crisis were coming when all the established authorities insisted otherwise? It's a question of method, not of what people think, but the way they think. In other words, if someone is always wrong, it's probably because they're thinking wrong. If they're usually right, it's because they're thinking right. Let's start with some people who are always wrong. The winners of the Nobel Prize in Economics. In fact, as LaRouche has been explaining for decades now, one of the criteria for even being considered for the Nobel Prize, with the single exception of France's Maurice Allais in 1988, is to have an economic theory with no demonstrable relationship to actual physical economic reality. Now that puts you in the running. But then to make it to the runner-up status, you have to use your delusional theory to make consistently erroneous forecasts. However, to actually win the Nobel Prize, you then have to go on to apply your policies to at least one country, resulting in that nation's economic disintegration. Then you win the big one. Let's take the case of 1970 Nobel winner Paul Samuelson. He's the guy who came up with the idea that depressions could never happen again, thanks to, quote, built-in stabilizers which automatically take care of everything. Samuelson is kind of the what me worry of economists. In his 1955 textbook, which has been used for decades to rinse generations of professional economists, Samuelson pronounced, and I quote, "The modern fiscal system has great inherent automatic stabilizing properties. All through the day and night, whether or not the president is in the White House, the fiscal system is helping keep our economy stable. If in 1980 a recession gets underway while Congress is out of session, powerful automatic forces will go instantly into action to counteract it before there are any committee meetings or the exercise of special intelligence of any form." Close quote. Most Nobel winners have followed Samuelson's dictum of doing without the exercise of intelligence of any form. In 1974, the guru of the fascist conservative revolution, about whom you will hear much more later, Friedrich von Hayek, won the award. 2 years later, the University of Chicago's Milton Friedman won it. His view can be summarized as the belief that the only thing that matters is money supply. Production is entirely irrelevant. Friedman has led the campaign for drug legalization and holds the British Crown colony of Hong Kong as his model. In 1990, Harry Markowitz and Merton Miller won the Nobel Prize for developing something called portfolio theory, which argues that futures contracts, just like other, quote, products, are valuable to those who buy them, and so they should not be regulated by the government. In 1992, Gary Becker was favored for, according to the Nobel Committee, quote, having extended the domain of economic theory to aspects of human behavior which had previously been dealt with, if at all, by other social science disciplines such as sociology, demography, and criminology, close quote. Becker, like Friedman, is for legalizing drugs and for eliminating the minimum wage. But things get wilder as the years go by. By 1993, Robert Vogel won the Nobel Economics Prize for his 1974 book defending U.S. slavery as economically progressive. And last year, John Nash, John Harsanyi, and Reinhard Selten received the honor for their pioneering work in the field of game theory, that is, the theoretical justification for the world derivatives crap game which we've just heard about. Bad ideas, bad methodology. LaRouche's method of physical economy traces back to Leibniz. It rejects as useless any monetary measurement of the economy, such as gross national product and balance of payments, none of which can distinguish between the value of $1 million invested in a steel plant and the same million invested in the construction of casinos and whorehouses in Las Vegas or Acapulco. Instead, in order to determine which kinds of productive activity increase the technological power of each member of the workforce with respect to nature, the LaRouche method measures the physical production of consumer goods, of the means of production, and of basic infrastructure which is useful for the reproductive economic process, and also measures its effects on the productivity of the labor force. All of this is measured by densities per capita, per household, which is the basic unit of social reproduction, and per square kilometer of total land and/or land in use. Economic success is most clearly expressed by the exponential increase in the relative potential population density of society. The fundamental source of such continuous improvements in social reproduction, LaRouche has emphasized, is human creativity, that quality which distinguishes man from and makes him superior to all other animal species. With this in mind, a properly growing physical economy must meet the following 4 criteria or constraints. Number 1, the per capita and per household consumption of the workforce must rise. Number 2, the consumption of producers' goods must also increase, and at a more rapid rate than that of consumer goods. That is, production must become increasingly capital intensive. Number 3, energy density per household and per square kilometer must also increase, as must the energy flux density of the power sources employed. That is to say, they must become more efficient as well as more dense. This is closely correlated with leaps in applied technologies. And finally, number 4, the so-called free energy of the system must increase relative to the total energy of the system. What that means is that even as the economy requires ever higher consumer and producers' goods markets baskets, the total output of the economic cycle must rise more rapidly still, making increased proportions of total output available for reinvestment and expansion. This latter requires constant technological progress and therefore human creativity. In other words, there is no steady state economy. There is either growth or there is decay and collapse. Very good. Let's briefly apply this approach to Mexico and Ibero-America as a whole and see how they fared. As we explained earlier, the last 15 years have witnessed a sharp rise in the speculative bubble called Mexico's real foreign debt, which is the blue line on the bottom. This rose from $57 billion in 1980 to a projected $265 billion in 1995, a nearly 5-fold increase. As you can see from this graph, this is more than the foreign debt of all Ibero-America, the red line, back in 1980, which was then $257 billion. Mexico's foreign debt today is greater than the foreign debt of all Ibero-America only 14 years ago. Ibero-America's official foreign debt in turn rose from $257 billion in 1980 to $547 billion in 1994. That's the green shaded area. That's the official foreign debt. But there are an additional $185 billion in other foreign obligations, the red component. Again, the hot money bubble of bonds and stocks that has erupted since 1989, which bring the total foreign debt up to $732 billion, nearly $750 billion. So Ibero-America's real foreign debt nearly tripled over this time period, 1980 to 1994. Now, I want to emphasize, this amount of debt, $750 billion, is not a problem in itself, so long as the rate of growth of the physical economy underlying it is more than keeping pace with it. In fact, I would propose that the nations of Ibero-America have no need to repudiate this debt outright. They should recommit themselves to paying it after a 20 to 30-year debt moratorium or cessation of payments, during which time they would studiously reject British free market economics and instead channel all their resources into real physical economic growth. With regional integration, an Ibero-American common market, great development projects and emphasis on 21st century technologies, Ibero-America can easily attain 10% per annum growth rates of tangible output, which over the course of 2 decades would mean a 6-fold rise in output, and over 3 decades would mean a 16-fold jump. And all of that is without even taking into account the non-linear leaps that technological revolutions would bring about. So the problem is not the debt. The problem is the growth of the usurious debt combined with a collapsing physical economy. So how did Ibero-America and Mexico fare in this regard over the past couple of decades? You will recall this graph which I showed you earlier. It shows the production of consumer and producer goods in Mexico, measured exclusively in physical economic units per capita and per household. The red line is consumer production, consumer good production, and the blue line is producer good production. So while the debt was soaring on the right over the 80s and 90s, real physical output from the high point of 81 was collapsing. Between 1981 and 1993, as the graph on the left screen shows, steel production per household fell by 27%. That's the first bar on the left. Grain by 22%, collapse, and cement fell by 2%. Meat production, which is the fourth bar, which you can't see very well, it rose by a paltry 2%. That's why you can't see it. The official foreign debt, however, soared by 234%, and that's the big red bar which you sure can see. Are you still wondering how LaRouche knew that the Mexico model was going to explode? Perhaps we'd better look at Ibero-America as a whole to see if the same thing is going on there. In this graph on the right, we are looking at the growth of Ibero-America's official foreign debt from 1980 to 1994. Those are the blue bars. And the cumulative interest paid over that same period, which are the red bars. For example, Ibero-America's debt in 1980 was $257 billion. And over the course of the next 14 years, they paid $417 billion in interest payments. That's the red number. And yet at the end of the period, they owed more than at the beginning, $547 billion. In other words, as you can see, it's clear as day, 257 minus 417 equals 547. That's what I call banker's arithmetic. And now, not surprisingly, this debt-looting process has taken its toll in the physical economy. To help calculate that impact, EIR has just developed preliminary market basket indices of production of consumer goods and producers' goods, which are similar to those developed earlier for Mexico, although they contain fewer products so far. The results, however, are conclusive. As with Mexico, Ibero-America saw a period of modest growth in both indices during the 1970s, but then stagnation and outright decline in the case of consumer goods, which is the red line, after the 1981 turning point. Now glance over to the other screen and look again at the growth of debt obligations and payments. You see the problem? So just how bad are things in Ibero-America? Well, grain production per capita, which is the centerpiece of any economy's ability to feed its population, rose by a meager 12% from 1970 to 1981. But between then and 1990, it plummeted by 21%. And although more recent numbers were not readily available, it is likely that it has declined further from 1990 to 1994. The 1990 level for Ibero-America, shown here, is 232 kilograms per capita, which compares with 1,181 kilograms per capita in the United States in 1980. The picture for steel is no better. Ibero-America's per household output in 1990 was no higher than what had been achieved 10 years earlier. Compare this 391 kilograms per household with 1,408 in the United States in 1980. The long and the short of it is that the policies of the IMF and the international oligarchy are Africanizing Ibero-America. They are rapidly reducing the region to conditions in which its physical economic reproduction will break down entirely, as has already occurred in large parts of Africa. I want to conclude this section of the panel and introduce our next speaker by making a forecast. First of all, the $50 billion package for Mexico may have bought some time, but it will in all likelihood not even get Mexico through 1995 in one piece. Mexico has about $63 billion in foreign obligations coming due with certainty over the course of 1995, which will overflow the $50 billion bailout. But there are an additional $45 billion in other foreign obligations, certain teso bonos, foreign investment in the stock market, and so on, which could also potentially be called in 1995. If that happens, as well it might, we are looking at $108 billion in obligations, twice the size of the giant package recently assembled. Not surprisingly, financial insiders in Mexico are already saying that the country will need another $50 billion in August of this year unless policies are radically reversed. But my forecast is that Mexico is not really the problem. Argentina is. Producer and consumer goods indices for Argentina show a worse pattern than for Mexico or Ibero-America as a whole. What I mean by that is that in Argentina there has been negative growth for 2 decades, not one. There was a collapse in the 1980s, like Mexico and the rest of Ibero-America, but unlike the rest, Argentina was decaying throughout the course of the 1970s as well. Argentina has endured 25 years of physical economic stagnation and decay, while all the while its debt bubble has been growing astronomically, the red line. Here we have graphed indices that show how debt has grown by 296% since 1981, while real production per capita and per household has collapsed. Steel production per household in Argentina has fallen by 7%. Grain has fallen by 27%. Cement dropped by 1/3. And meat production in Argentina, once one of the world powerhouses of meat production and consumption, has plummeted by a shocking 35%. Yet all the while, the debt has risen and risen. The policies of the current Menem government, and particularly those of his Harvard-trained economics minister, Domingo Cavallo, have worsened this already grave crisis and are about to result in a total blowout of the Argentine banking system. Cavallo and Menem are doing in Argentina almost exactly what Salinas and Finance Minister Aspe did in Mexico, only worse. Cavallo, indeed, seems well on his way to winning a Nobel Prize for economics.